Okay, picture this. You are a medical researcher, and you need to definitively prove whether a specific physical activity is perfectly safe for a developing baby. Normally, in the world of science, you just set up a highly controlled randomized experiment, right? You'd separate people into groups, control every single variable, and measure what happens. But what do you do when that experiment is ethically impossible? We literally cannot risk the health of a pregnant woman or a fetus just to satisfy our scientific curiosity. So, how on earth do we establish these airtight, reliable medical guidelines when we aren't even allowed to test the very thing we're trying to understand? Welcome to today's Explainer. We are going to unpack a pretty fascinating medical detective story, specifically looking at the science of pregnancy and physical intimacy, focusing on intercourse and orgasm. For decades, medical advice on this was based on guesswork, extreme caution, and frankly, some pretty wild old wives' tales. Doctors would just tell people to abstain entirely, simply because they didn't have the data. But eventually, scientists actually managed to solve this puzzle without ever running that perfect experiment. Instead, they cleverly layered three different types of evidence to build an absolutely bulletproof consensus. So here is our roadmap. We'll quickly cover the impossible experiment, then we'll dive into real-time evidence, big data tracking, the body's natural protection, high-risk exceptions, and finally, the medical consensus. All right, let's start right at the beginning with part one, the impossible experiment. As we mentioned, the gold standard of science is the randomized controlled trial. But imagine trying to randomly divide pregnant individuals into two groups, mandating that Group A absolutely must experience orgasms on a strict schedule, while Group B is completely forbidden from any intimacy for 9 months. It's a total ethical and logistical nightmare. No way that gets approved. So science had to get really clever. Researchers completely pivoted away from controlled trials and leaned heavily into super precise observational methods and advanced physiological monitoring. Basically, they let people just live their normal lives, but applied cutting-edge instruments to observe the natural results. Which brings us to part two, real-time evidence. To get this real-time evidence, researchers worked with volunteers in entirely safe, totally unforced conditions. They wanted to see exactly what happens to the body in the moment. To pull this off, they used three specific tools. First, CTG monitoring. This doesn't just check if the heart is beating, it captures tiny, minute-by-minute variations in the fetal heart rate. Second, they tracked uterine contractions, measuring the exact duration and amplitude to see how much force is actually happening. And third, good old ultrasound to watch the movement in high definition. It's basically giving scientists a microscopic, real-time window into the womb. Now, you might be wondering, does the data show things actually changing during intimacy? Well, yes, it does. The fetal heart rate might bump up slightly, and the uterus might experience some mild, fleeting contractions. To an untrained eye, that might sound kind of alarming. But actually, scratch that. It's completely fine. This was a massive relief to researchers because the monitors proved these are just normal, temporary physiological fluctuations. They are totally disorganized and lack the rhythmic, building intensity of real labor. Within just moments, everything settles right back to baseline. There is absolutely zero emergency signal being triggered here. Moving on to part three, big data tracking. So now we scale way up. Instead of tracking minutes, researchers zoomed out to track thousands of pregnancies over several months using massive cohort studies. They just naturally split the data into those reporting active intimacy and those who didn't. Now, if orgasms genuinely triggered early labor, trust me, the data at this scale would scream at us. We'd see a glaring, undeniable spike in premature births. But the actual outcome? For low-risk pregnancies, the statistical difference between the two groups is absolute zero. The long-term macro data seamlessly, perfectly backs up the real-time micro data. Let's dive into part four, the body's protection. This really answers the fundamental why. How does human biology pull this off? Well, it's engineered a wildly robust defense system. Let's look at it from the outside in. Step one, amniotic fluid. The fetus isn't just sitting there, it's floating in a highly effective biological shock absorber. Step two, the cervix. It's protected by a thick mucus plug and remains tightly closed, kind of like a locked vault door sealing off the environment. Step three, hormones. Yes, an orgasm releases oxytocin, which does drive labor, but the amount released during intimacy is literally a drop in the bucket compared to the massive tidal wave required to actually kickstart clinical labor. The body's defenses are simply too strong. But of course, science thrives on nuance. That brings us to part five, high-risk exceptions. If the mechanism is so incredibly safe, why do doctors sometimes say no? Well, the medical boundaries are actually crystal clear here. For standard, low-risk pregnancy, you are absolutely good to go. No restrictions. But if a patient has a history of premature birth, a supersensitive uterus, or something like placenta previa, where the placenta is sitting dangerously low, the math completely changes. In those specific high-risk scenarios, doctors will say avoid stimulation completely, just to minimize every possible risk. The crucial takeaway here is a massive mindset shift. The physical intimacy itself isn't suddenly some dangerous weapon. It's that a pre-existing medical condition has compromised the entire environment, making the uterus intensely vulnerable to literally any disruption. It is a baseline issue, not an action issue. If your baseline is a healthy pregnancy, the action remains perfectly biologically safe.
And finally, part 6, the medical consensus.
You know how doctors literally never say something is 100% absolutely safe without a shadow of a doubt? Yeah, it can be frustrating. Instead, they use a very carefully chosen phrase, no evidence of harm. To you and me, that might sound overly cautious, almost like they aren't totally sure. But in the scientific community, that is the absolute highest form of reassurance. It means that after throwing every physiological tracker, huge data set, and biological stress test at this question, they haven't found a single credible threat for healthy pregnancy.
And that consensus isn't just a lucky guess. It is the flawless overlap of our 3 scientific pillars. Real-time monitoring shows no immediate danger signals. Big data proves there are no long-term negative trends, and our biology confirms the body is literally built to handle it. Think about it. One observational study could just be a fluke, right? But all 3 of these totally distinct approaches, independently pointing to the exact same truth, that is how you build a truly bulletproof medical consensus.
So, this explainer isn't just about the biology of pregnancy. It's honestly a masterclass in how evidence actually works in the real world. We often wait around for the single, perfect study to drop out of the sky and tell us what to do. But real science is messy. Sometimes perfect experiments are just impossible. So the next time you see a flashy headline making a wild health claim, ask yourself, is this built on one isolated, sensationalized test? Or is it built on a rock-solid foundation of overlapping clues? Real-time data, long-term trends, and fundamental biology all telling the same story. Because if it doesn't have all 3, it might just be a house of cards. Keep asking those tough questions, demand better evidence, and I'll see you in the next explainer.